Hello everybody, today we're going to be talking about a book and a hypothesis that a number of people have asked me about. And to be honest, it's a book that I'm a huge fan of, written by an author who I have an immense amount of respect for, namely Advances in Proto-Basque Reconstruction with Evidence for the Proto-Indo-European-Euskarian Hypothesis by Juliette Blevins. I'm Learn Hittite, this is what we're going to be talking about today. Let's get stuck into it. Now, I want to say from the outset that I know very little about the Basque language. In fact, almost everything that I know comes from reading about Basque in terms of its potential relationship with Indo-European or other language families. I actually first picked up this book by Blevins on the reconstruction of Proto-Basque and its relationship to Indo-European, not because I was interested in Basque or Indo-European, but because I was aware of her previous work on the Austronesian languages, which I've had a passing interest in over the last few years. I'd like to stress firstly that Blevins is actually a very talented linguist in her own right, and she's proven herself to be capable in the field of phonology, for example, and also she has experience with showing the relationships between languages and language families. I'd actually like to recommend specifically 3 works of Blevins which I think show her talent as a linguist and would be interesting for any other linguist to take a look at. So firstly, and in no particular order, we have her book Evolutionary Phonology is well worth checking out. I particularly enjoyed her writing about uncommon sound patterns such as clicks and the acquisition patterns for speakers of languages which have them. She mentions voiceless vowels, which I didn't even realise were a thing until I read her book. It reads really well, published by Cambridge, and you can pick it up secondhand on Amazon for less than $40. Next up, we've got her 2007 article titled A Long Lost Sister of Proto-Austronesian, Proto-Ngan, Mother of Yarawa and Nge of the Andaman Islands. Now, I know I've done videos on the indo-uralic hypothesis, and I've said that I'm a big fan of, for example, the Uralo-Siberian hypothesis by Fortescue, but I'm actually more of a splitter than a lumper. However, I love well-written, well-researched attempts to find relationships between languages, regardless of whether I think they're right or wrong. This is an example where I think the author is right. Blevins applied the comparative method to analyse 2 closely related languages from the southern Andaman Islands, Yarawa and Nge. She then reconstructed the hypothetical ancestral language termed Proto-Ngan and identified consistent sound changes in each of its descendant languages. Following this, Blevins utilised the same method to establish a linguistic relationship between Proto-Ngan and Proto-Austronesian. Importantly, both lexical and grammatical evidence supported the proposition that Proto-Ngan and Proto-Austronesian are sister languages, which emerged from a common ancestral language termed Proto-Austronesian Ngan. Very interesting and compelling stuff. It's free to download, I believe, from Blevins' personal website. And finally, in 2001, she published a paper on Nhanda, an Australian Aboriginal language, and she worked with the last known speaker. She manages to write extensively about the phonology, morphology, and syntax of the language, alongside presenting a really informative introduction going through the territory where the language was spoken, surrounding languages, the people who spoke it, and the history of its research. It really helps, being someone who is so distant from this language community, to have some context for the language. Also, you can tell, and she even mentions it in the preface, that this was a really bittersweet moment for Blevins because she gets to achieve one of these dreams that many linguists have of documenting a dramatically endangered language, and then of course the bitterness of it actually being on the verge of extinction. This is a common thread in many of her academic works. She's not afraid to add a bit of personal background and feeling. It's a nice touch, and it gets the reader invested in what she's got to say. And so what about the book itself? Well, it's 400 pages and it's published by Routledge, who have a reputation for being quite a good publisher. You know, they generally don't publish dodgy material anyway. Broadly speaking, the book is divided into 3 parts. The first part is her reconstruction of Proto-Basque. The second part is where she attempts to compare it to Proto-Indo-European. There's some statistical analysis and stuff like that. And the third part is the quite lengthy appendix, where she lists reconstructed Proto-Basque roots and in many cases tries to find cognates in Indo-European. She has published her corrections online, and in addition to this book there are 2 supplementary articles. One is free to access and the second one is behind a paywall, but they are worth picking up because they really do complement the book, and they're actually Blevins' response to some of the criticism that was levelled towards this text. So we really do need to have our hands on both of those articles. And I'd just like to say it's impossible for me to cover all of the ideas that Blevins expresses in this book because it's just too much and she goes through a lot. If you're interested in the hypothesis, you just need to pick up the book and the associated articles. That being said, it is amazingly well priced for a book of this character. I picked up this copy for $40 US on Amazon delivered, which I think is a great price compared to some other similar books that deal with historical linguistics or proto-language reconstructions. And then you need to factor in like an additional $30 for access to that one article that I told you about, but it is worth it. And yeah, great value for money. Pick it up, it's a good book. Major reviews of the book include the following. During the video, I might refer to a recent-ish YouTube video published by Jackson Crawford, who I also recommend his books a lot if you like Old Norse language and myth. And in the video, he was with Dr. Gorton and Professor Yates. They discussed Blevins' book and her hypothesis, and I might refer to some of the things that they spoke about from time to time. So what exactly is the hypothesis that Juliette Blevins puts forward in her book? Well, in the introduction to part 2 of her book, she actually states the hypothesis. So let's check it out. Regular sound correspondences between Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European in proposed cognates, including basic vocabulary and grammatical morphemes, are not accidental and are not due to borrowing. These correspondences may therefore be taken as evidence of common descent. Conservative phonological and morphological features of Proto-Basque in relation to Proto-Indo-European suggest that Proto-Basque did not descend from Proto-Indo-European. Instead, Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European should be seen as sister languages, or daughters of sister languages, descending from the same mother tongue. Now, as far as I can tell, she's actually the first linguist to put forward such a hypothesis. There have been other attempts by other scholars to demonstrate that Basque is actually some type of Indo-European language, but generally those ideas have been dismissed by other researchers and scholars when they've reviewed the material. There are also some macro family proposals like Borean, which do group Indo-European and Basque together. But actually these proposals include most of the world's language families, and even then Indo-European isn't grouped particularly close with Basque. Interestingly, the Eurasiatic hypothesis, which we spoke about in a recent video, doesn't include Basque in its quite large grouping of related languages, or supposedly related languages. So the main obstacle that I can see when reviewing this book and the hypothesis, and similar comments were actually expressed in the Jackson Crawford video and in the review by Bakker, is that there are probably fewer than 5 people in the world who have enough knowledge of both Proto-Indo-European and Basque to actually critique the hypothesis properly. Although Bakker is actually probably being modest here because he has also published articles on Basque and Indo-European languages, so he's likely to be better qualified than most to give an opinion. That being said, it's not going to stop me from having a look at the hypothesis and the book, so let's take a look at some of the evidence we have for the Proto-Indo-European-Euskarian hypothesis, shall we? Maybe a good idea to begin with would be to look at some of the similarities and differences between the proposed language families. And actually Bakker, in his review, goes over some of the major differences between Basque and its Indo-European buddies. Here on screen we have some of the main ones. Basque has an ergative alignment. Verbs agree with subject, object and the indirect object. There is no grammatical gender or gender in personal pronouns. There is a tendency to prefer postpositions. Basque can palatise consonants to express a diminutive meaning. Basque is the only language in Europe with different constituent orders in negative and positive sentences. Basque has gender-distinct allocutive verb forms. Now, some of these differences highlighted by Bakker are not particularly important on the proto level. For example, Proto-Indo-European probably had some form of ergative alignment in its earliest forms, although the exact nature of which is murky. And regarding things like prepositions versus postpositions, well, postpositions are known in Indo-European languages, and both prepositions and postpositions in Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European probably form themselves out of earlier adverbials. But basically what Bakker was trying to show here in his review of the hypothesis and the book by Blevins was to show how different Basque is grammatically from the surrounding Indo-European languages. He doesn't stop there, however, and he uses numerals as an example of how different the lexicon is. Blevins' book unfortunately doesn't make an attempt to reconcile the grammatical differences between Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European. However, there is at least some effort to remedy this in her 2020 article, probably as a response to feedback towards her book. It doesn't necessarily do much to bridge the gap between the grammar of Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European, though it does add to our knowledge of word structure in Proto-Basque, and she seems to find evidence for a nominalizer S suffix. A big part of Blevins' book that has received significant amount of attention from linguists, both amateur and professional, is actually the appendix where she gives Proto-Basque reconstructions alongside Proto-Indo-European comparisons. But before we can delve into this body of evidence, we need to take a look at the vowel and consonant systems of Proto-Basque as set up by Blevins. We'll skip over the vowels, however, as she is in rough agreement with other scholars on the matter, with 5 simple vowels and the presence of diphthongs being debated. However, it is the consonant system of Proto-Basque that Blevins reconstructs that is noticeably different from how other Basque scholars have seen it in the past. On the screen now, we can see the revised consonant inventory Blevins puts forward in comparison with another well-known proposal by Michelena. Now, obviously there are a few differences, but what stood out first for me was the presence of this consonant in Blevins' reconstruction. The lack of a bilabial nasal in Proto-Basque is kind of famous in linguistics because it is said to be quite rare among world languages. and as Blevins states herself, she can't think of another language that lacks an M but has both an N and a B. So Blevins' reconstruction with a labial nasal makes her Proto-Basque more typologically bland, we can say, which does appear to make her reconstruction perhaps more attractive. However, obviously, there must be a reason why the bilabial nasal is missing from other reconstructions. So I went to read Larry Trask's Towards a History of the Basque Language, and he notes the following reasons in support of Proto-Basque lacking a bilabial nasal. Namely, that most other consonants in Basque make an appearance in its rich inflectional morphology. The M conspicuously doesn't, nor does it appear in any word of any grammatical function. And the very common presence of M in modern Basque is due to clear loan words of no great antiquity, and that the ancient words that do apparently contain an M all show evidence of it having evolved from an earlier B. So, both reconstructing Basque with a bilabial nasal and without have their merits. However, Blevins, of course, comes to the argument with her own ammunition. She cites the following as evidence for Proto-Basque possessing the bilabial nasal. Firstly, she argues that Basque does have native words with M. Here are some examples. She also notes that very often in languages that possess no labial nasal, loan words often replace the M with another labial or nasal that the language does possess. There is little to no evidence for this in Basque, implying that the M sound was known to Basque speakers and that they had no trouble incorporating loans with the sound into their speech. Finally, Blevins notes that her consonant system reconstruction is rather unremarkable, which she argues is more likely to be accurate than a consonant inventory system, which is rather unusual in the context of world languages as seen in the reconstructions of other linguists. As I said, both sides of the argument have merit. The uniqueness of Basque lacking an M whilst possessing an N and a B is definitely a concern for those reconstructions which lack it. My audience is pretty knowledgeable on such things, so I'll ask the question: are there any languages out there which are similar to the standard Proto-Basque reconstructions by Trask, Michelena, Lacara and others in this regard? That is, that the language lacks an M but possesses an N and a B. Blevins states that there are not, but maybe she has overlooked something. But either way, such consonant systems must be rare. Okay, as I mentioned before, Blevins' reconstructions have gathered a lot of interest from people, and they are mainly found in the lengthy appendix to the book. She presents reconstructions of Proto-Basque roots, their modern descendants, and potential Proto-Indo-European cognates. Generally, she only compares Proto-Basque with Proto-Indo-European, not descendant languages of Proto-Indo-European. She cites her sources for each meaning, which actually is not something to be taken for granted in works like this, and she uses modern Basque, all dialects, and the oldest forms she can find to derive her meanings. She incorporates data from Aquitanian inscriptions, funerary and votive texts. All sounds pretty good, right? In Jackson Crawford's video on the book and the hypothesis, the gentleman mentioned a few reconstructions that stood out to them. Let's take a look at those. So first they mentioned this one, meaning speak, talk or speech. Blevins gives 5 terms from modern Basque to support this reconstruction. And she compares this to the following Proto-Indo-European form, meaning to speak, say. Trask, however, in his Etymological Dictionary of Basque, published online posthumously, doesn't have this root and in fact presents a completely different form for say and declares that the pre-Basque form for speak is impossible to recover, so perhaps we have an example of some academic disagreement there. I've checked Blevins' examples that she gives to support her reconstruction, and they seem to be correct. The Proto-Indo-European form is uncontroversial. Another one was this Proto-Basque form meaning animal fat. It is strikingly similar to this Proto-Indo-European form given by Fortson, meaning goose. Jackson Crawford mentions in the YouTube video that this sort of semantic drift in meaning is possible, and he's absolutely right. However, this comparison is held up a little bit, and actually Blevins does note this in her work, by the fact that it may well be a loan from a surrounding contact language. That being said, Blevins' reconstruction seems sound, and the root form she bases it on is confirmed by Trask in his etymological dictionary. Interestingly though, the Proto-Indo-European example given here is actually sometimes used as a piece of evidence in support of the indo-uralic hypothesis, because of the correspondence in the initial position between Proto-Indo-European and Uralic. So make of that what you will. Ualde, 2020, a renowned Basque linguist who has published work on Indo-European languages also, reviewed Blevins' book in his article on the evolution of Basque and is critical of the broad meaning Blevins often ascribes to her Proto-Basque roots. In his work, he cites a reconstructed Proto-Basque form meaning long, along, extending, run through, and the Basque evidence for this Blevins gives as this form, odol, meaning blood. The broadening of this meaning allows her to compare it with the Proto-Indo-European forms, which is obviously methodologically unsound. The author states, amongst other observations, that some of the reconstructed forms and supported evidence appear, after all, to be simple loans from Romance languages, alongside in one or two places where Blevins appears to have added meanings which are not actually found in the sources that she cites. In fact, Ualde also notes Eduardo Blasco-Ferrer as part of his Proto-Basque Paleo-Sardinian hypothesis, sees the Proto-Basque form as simply meaning red, with evidence of this coming from Sardinian toponyms. However, when all is said and done, and despite a few issues, Blevins provides many reconstructions, all with sources so the reader can do their own investigations. And they all consistently follow her correspondences, which she lays out nicely in her book. Here are some of my favourites. And here's one or two that I have some concerns about. In Diachronica, Volume 38, Issue 4, Blevins teams up with Richard Sproat in order to apply more rigorous statistical analysis to the Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European correspondences by using a Monte Carlo simulation and aggressively stripping potential loans from the model. Long story short, and not beating about the bush like the authors do in the article, the results of the analysis show that Blevins' Proto-Basque reconstruction and Proto-Indo-European are related languages. The big issue, however, is that the model uses Blevins' own data, an issue she herself identifies in the text. It would be interesting to see the results of the same analysis with Trask's pre-Basque reconstructions or a set of reconstructions that use a more standard Basque phonology. Another exciting observation that Blevins presents is that the Proto-Indo-European laryngeal series appears to be observable in Basque. I'll be honest, I was at first a little dubious of these correspondences because I thought that the presence of the H or aspiration in some of Blevins' reconstructions was at least sometimes unfounded. An example would be her reconstruction for bone. Archaic Basque lacks an H, yet Blevins chooses to reconstruct the proto-form as having one. Millet is another good example. Some instances of H are also restricted to certain Basque dialects, which at least indicates to me that this might be some type of local innovation. However, there are plenty of reconstructions Blevins gives with an H that are actually in agreement with other scholars. So I will defer to their expertise. And what about the homeland and chronology of Proto-Indo-European-Euskarian, I hear you ask? Well, Blevins sees the ultimate homeland of the proto-language as being wherever Proto-Indo-European originated, migrating from the steppe area prior to 6500 BP and before Proto-Indo-European-Euskarian speakers had the wheel or the plough, and that Proto-Basque speakers may be associated with the spread of agriculture throughout the region. Blevins cites Gunter et al. 2015 as genetic evidence linking Basque speakers with the spread of agriculture and their genetic affinity with the people of Sardinia. Yeah, so what can we say overall about this hypothesis? Well, there's a lot to it, but if we dig down to the bare bones of the hypothesis, stating that ultimately Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European might be distantly related, well then that may well be true. And as we spoke about in the recent video on Indo-Uralic, Proto-Indo-European is unlikely to have been an isolate. However, going as far as describing Proto-Indo-European and Proto-Basque as sister or cousin languages, well, I'm not sure we can say that based on Blevins' work at the moment. And don't get me wrong, as I said earlier, I love the book, and Blevins provides a wealth of data. She cites her sources and is consistent in the rules she applies in her reconstructions. All admirable stuff. That combined with her background means we have to take this as a serious book. There are issues and problems with the work and the hypothesis in general. Some I've mentioned. For example, that in areas Blevins seems to have added to her definition of Basque terms out of nowhere, or at least nowhere I could find. Although again, this is a minor criticism because at least she cites where she's getting her evidence for her reconstructions, so we can actually go and check. Also, her reconstruction of Proto-Basque differs a lot from previous ideas, and it differs in ways that just happen to make it easier to find correspondences in Proto-Indo-European. The work would undoubtedly benefit from some additional contributors and co-authors, and not just names in the acknowledgements. Maybe not to the extent of this book, for example, whereby some of the contributors seem to have just refashioned an article on Indo-European into one about Indo-Uralic by adding a paragraph in the conclusion, but perhaps the addition of another Basque expert and a dedicated Indo-Europeanist would be nice to see. Because after all, it's worth remembering that when Blevins wrote the book, she had 5 years of experience with Basque. I'm not doubting her knowledge, but 5 years just isn't a lot of time. The fact that morphology was barely touched upon during the book is a limitation for me, and it is the standout area of future research. How can these two dramatically different grammatical systems be reconciled? The hypothesis also suffers from the fact that Proto-Indo-European reconstruction has had orders of magnitude greater academic hours dedicated to it, alongside it being able to draw from a wide variety of well-attested daughter languages spreading across a significant time span. The earliest Indo-European language we have attested is the Kanashite Hittite recorded on cuneiform tablets excavated in Kanesh and dating to the 2nd millennium BCE. There are possibly some earlier examples of Indo-European fossilised in the Anatolian personal names in the Ebla archives, but either way, this is significantly earlier than the oldest Basque text, which is dated to the 1st century BCE only. Proto-Basque is somewhat lacking therefore in this regard, and that's no fault of the author in question, but it is a limitation that has to be acknowledged in terms of Proto-Basque reconstruction. The time depth issue means that we actually are not necessarily talking about sister or cousin languages, but if anything, cousin languages many times removed. And I'd also like to state that despite the many number of hours dedicated to it, there are still some question marks concerning the exact form of Indo-European in a variety of ways in its earliest stages. What exactly was its alignment system? What exactly was the stop inventory like? How many laryngeals are we talking about and how were they pronounced? This means that when Blevins tried her deeper statistical analysis on Proto-Basque and Proto-Indo-European, the analysis was limited by the fact that the model depended on her data and doesn't take into consideration some of the question marks surrounding the earliest Indo-European reconstructions. If the earliest forms of Proto-Indo-European still have question marks around them, despite the heavy attention it receives in the literature, how confident can we really be with our understanding of Proto-Basque? The authors who have contributed to Proto-Basque we could probably count on a single hand. And this isn't just a limitation of this hypothesis, it's true for, say, the indo-uralic hypothesis also. As I said earlier, I personally like to see some sort of statistical analysis applied to other proto or pre-Basque reconstructions that are out there. Although that's problematic too, because if we look at Trask's etymological dictionary, it's actually unfinished at the time of his passing and was completed and published by a colleague. We can only guess at what changes, revisions or additions Trask would have made before its final publication. But personally, I enjoy the scholarship that goes into works like this, and I love reading such books. But it doesn't mean that I'm convinced by it. This book definitely adds a different perspective on Proto-Basque reconstruction, and I think Blevins for sure has furthered our knowledge in that regard. There are a limited number of people in the world that can adequately review this book. That being said, there are people who have the expertise to review this book, and some of them have, and they all show their doubts towards this hypothesis. They all commend Blevins' work, saying similar things to what I've said. She's consistent, she cites her sources, things like that, but that there's too many issues to say that this hypothesis is worthy of further consideration. And for me, as a relative newbie in terms of Basque and Proto-Basque, I have to share these doubts as well and defer to what other experts say. Well, what do you think about such a hypothesis? Do you think there's any merit to it? I'd be interested to know your opinions. Please drop me them in the comments. As always, please give me a like, subscribe, do all that good stuff for the algorithm. You've been fantastic. As always, I'm Learn Hittite. I'll be back very soon with something interesting to discuss. Goodbye for now.